So I am Jo Flick. I am the Continuing Education Coordinator at the Montana State Library. And my background is actually not in librarianship, but in instructional design. And my first degree was in art, but I quickly discovered it was not really easy to make a living in that with that degree. So moved on and have been working in instructional design and developing instructional materials for K-12 schools and for adults most of my career. So I am going to share with you some thoughts today about surveys and questionnaires, and we're going to get started in our discussion. And then over the next 3 weeks, we're going to kind of take a fairly deep dive into how to structure our questionnaires so that they're more successful. So, and I do have a couple of questions for you guys today too. So be prepared to get in the chat box and get engaged with the class. So just a note, you have a control panel probably to the right of the control panel image that I'm showing you on the screen right now. And I just want to point out two important parts of that control panel. One is the little tab to the upper left of the control panel, and specifically that arrow at the very top of the tab. That arrow will collapse your control panel, and I'd suggest you try that right now, just clicking on it, and it will make it disappear, or actually it doesn't actually disappear, it just collapses into a little tab. And then if you click on that arrow again, it will expand your control panel. So the chat box is toward the bottom of your control panel. Yours will look just a little different than mine looks, but it's still it's in the same place. It's toward the bottom. And you'll want to expand your chat box. It'll have a plus sign or a little triangle if you're on a Mac, and you'll want to click on that little box to the left of the word chat, and that will expand the control panel. And then you can also, I'll just point out that if you grab the chat box and click and drag it away, you can remove it from the rest of the control panel, basically disengage it. You can also do that by using this little icon right here that looks like a box with an arrow jumping out of it. And if you want to remove not see any of these things, although you really do want to see the chat, that's what the X is for, so you can take those off from your control panel if they bother you. So with that, that's pretty much the most essential things you need to know about using GoToTraining. Let's get on to what you need to know about surveys. And let's see, to get my cursor back. So our plan today is to explore some different types of surveys. And really, we're going to talk about the difference between what is a survey and what is a questionnaire. And then we're going to kind of think about what types of questions you might be able to answer with a survey. And we're going to talk a little bit about alternative methods to surveys. So that's our plan for today. So we'll start with this. You can survey in many different ways. A questionnaire is a specific way that you're going to survey. And I am going to survey you all right now using not a questionnaire, but a poll, which is a real simple version of a questionnaire. So give me a second and we'll get some of those polls up so we can get started. The first question I want to ask is, do you want to keep to our original schedule and meet next Monday on President's Day? Or do you want to change our schedule for this class and move it back a week, meet 2 weeks from today, and then the following week? Keep the original schedule, or let's reschedule. And I see about half of you have actually voted. So all you have to do, most of you are figuring this out, is click on the radio button next to your choice, hit enter, and still waiting for a couple people to ring in. I can actually see how many folks are remaining. So please just get in there and make a choice. I'll give you 10 seconds more and then we'll go. We've got 83%, 89% have voted, so just waiting for 1 or 2 people. And we're going to go ahead and close this poll. So I do want to share what we've seen. And as you can see, most people would like to reschedule. A slight majority, well, in the world of politics, this would be a whopping majority. So about 2/3 of you would prefer to reschedule, which I'm happy to do. So when we finish today, I will reschedule. And I also point out that we are recording all of these sessions, and you will have in our Google folder a link to the recording. So if you have to miss a week, don't give up your seat and cancel, because you can get back the following week. All right, let's take another poll. All right, so now that you're getting good at this, what kind of library do you represent? I always like to know who's in the audience. And okay, just about 2/3 of you have voted. So now you may not have had a big opinion about whether or not to reschedule a class, but you should know what kind of library you are. And if for some reason the list I have here doesn't represent your type of library, then just click other, which it looks like some people are doing. Still waiting for a couple people. There's always the chance that somebody has stepped away to take a phone call, and I'll be sitting here waiting for them. And so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. We've got about 83% of our folks online today have taken it, and I want to share with you. So we have a good variety here. There's about not quite half of you, 40% are public libraries, 13% school or college library, 20% special, and 27%, that's quite a lot, of other. So I'd really like to know, if you click that other and could put in the chat box what type of library you are. And we have no library districts here today. So this is interesting to me in the context of our discussion today, because when you put together a survey or questionnaire or poll, it's important to get the right questions. So here's, Anita. So she's at a tribal library, which is college and public. Yes. So there's a good example. Anita had to click other because the polling tool that we have doesn't allow her to click both public and school or college library. And I didn't give tribal library an option for her. So that's important to keep in mind. And Colleen up in Alberta said that Parkland Regional is a consortium of locally governed public libraries. Yeah, okay. A consortium as opposed to a library district. So that's interesting. I didn't give her that option. And then Jody from Drummond, Montana said, it's really 3. She's 3 of those things. Yes. It's very important as you're putting together questionnaires to frame your questions and the response options in a way that it makes it possible for our respondents to give a factual answer. All right, so let's just hide that, and let's see. I've got one more for you. Sorry to be doing all these, but I really want to know, what level of expertise do you have in creating? Boy, I really struggled with this question too, because I don't have a lot of options in creating these polls in GoToTraining, and I tried to get answers that everybody could respond to. It'll be interesting to see how we get here, what happens. So have you never created a survey and you're coming to this class to learn everything? Have you written lots? Too many to count? Got some of those. Created several. Okay, got about 78%. Let's see, anybody else want to get in and vote here? Vote is a polling term. Just give it. Maybe you don't feel any of these really respond to you, in which case I'd be interested to see in the chat box why. Maybe you just don't like polls. That's a possibility too. That's always So here are the results. So a lot of people are saying they've done this a little bit. A few more people are saying they've done several, and very few people, and about the same, are either complete novices or maybe experts. So if you have some expertise, I'd certainly invite you to share that while we work our way through the class. I don't consider myself an expert. I've prepared some things to think about, and hopefully we'll actually learn a lot from each other over the next couple of weeks. So with that, thank you for participating in our polls, and maybe that'll get you in the right frame of mind to be thinking about this as well, this whole topic. By the way, if your smartphone is nearby, I would encourage you to grab it, because toward the end, if we have time, we're gonna do some polls using an online tool where you can respond in real time using your smartphone. I just want to show you the tool. I think it's cool, and I've used it a lot. And so if you have your smartphone nearby, or an iPad, or any other tablet, that would be really great. So my first question is to you: why are you even bothering to take this class? And I'm looking for you to respond in the chat box here about, why do you think it is that we really do feel like we need to evaluate things at the library stuff? I'll give you a couple minutes here to think about that. So Beth was saying we need to do assessment. Yes, I agree with you, Beth. I mean, that's a goal at the state library. We're required by our funder to assess our training activities. For example, actually all of our funded activities. Jeannie says to help hone in on which groups of people we're missing. Yes, maybe to design a new service, you need to learn more about a group. Jody says the annual report, the Montana State Library report requires a survey. That's right. And Jody says regular surveys are required by state standards, yes. To justify budgeting is one of the really great answers here. I hope you're looking at these in the chat box in case I missed something. Also, to find out what services patrons use the most and least, yes. So making good decisions, maybe. That's why that information is important. Find out what people want from us, what they're already doing. Maybe they just didn't know. How about 2 of 2? Yes. Perhaps the same survey too many times. Perhaps, they're doing the same survey too many times and no better questions could be asked. So you suspect, Ray, that there's a better way to do this whole process. Anita says yearly surveys are part of our evaluation of our services. It's a component of our college accreditation. Mm-hmm. And what did Jamie say? Some of these. To find out what people want from us and what they're already doing, and they just didn't know we were doing it. Exactly. So maybe to help inform. You could use a survey to help inform. And then Stacy says it's part of our strategic plan to assess what's going on. So it sounds like a lot of people are doing it because it is a part of their process or a requirement of some kind. And Sarah's saying surveying Montana libraries on their legal information needs is on her to-do list as our state law librarian. And Stefan says to understand what you're doing well. That's true. So that you don't, a lot of times we look at evaluation as a way to try to improve, but maybe it's also a way of trying to remember to do the same thing. And Jody says that she's been disappointed by participation in their surveys and wondered if it was the format. We're going to talk a little bit about that because I do think that questionnaires, especially, we can get survey fatigue, and our audience can get survey fatigue. She also adds that I have some skepticism when it comes to surveys, but they do tend to show trends. It's good to have that skepticism. You be sure to hang on to that and point out when I say something that maybe you take issue with, Jody, because that's really a very good point of view. So I want you to think about the last time you conducted some kind of evaluation or survey or questionnaire. And let me back up here 1 minute. So what specific purpose did you have in mind? And make a note for yourself right now, or post something in the chat room, but keep this situation in mind for the session. So think about the last time you conducted an evaluation of something related to your library service, something you really want to evaluate right now. And just keep that in mind. You can post in the chat box if you want to, but you don't have to. But I think it will be helpful as we're going through the rest of the session today to have something really specific that matters to you in mind. Okay? So we're going to start with this idea, the research question. So I got introduced to this as I was working on a really a big project, and we had to hire a third-party evaluator. This was some years ago. And this person spent quite a bit of time working with our team to develop this research question. At first, I thought she was spending way too much time. But then as we got through the process, I really learned that that research question we kept coming back to over and over again really helped us to develop the rest of our evaluation tools, instruments, and to implement a quality evaluation. So research questions are something that scientists do. You know, sometimes we might refer to it as similar idea as a hypothesis in science. But in our case with social research, which is the kind that we're doing when we're asking people their opinions about things, the research question just helps us frame how we're going to get to the bottom of that question. And oftentimes we skip this step, and I think it's something you'll regret later. So here's some tips on how to create a good quality research question. And I'm talking about one question. That's the other thing that often we'll do is we'll start with one research question, but then we'll create like 6 questions. And what you want to try to do is to get your research question down to 1. Good, really good, excellent question. So we're going to spend a little time practice it on that. And I just want to mention we've got one person said that they're thinking about doing a library tour and they want to know how to evaluate that. So that's a good example. So we can maybe use that example as to create a research question using some of these guidelines. So you want to keep to one issue, and you want to check to be sure that the question is not just a yes or no answer. And I've got some practice on this in a minute. You want it to be focused, and it should be focused on the specific audience that you have in mind. It should be focused in terms of time, a specific time frame. It's not always applicable, but usually it is. And perhaps a specific location, and definitely a specific topic. So you want to avoid murky, vague language. And by that I mean, if you put a lot of ands and ors into your research question, it's going to start to get more vague. So you might have to have an and or an or in your question, but you want to try to limit those down to as few as possible. You also probably don't want to put in many qualifiers or adjectives in your research question. So maybe not things like, we want for Diane's library tour, we want to know if our patrons would like a excellent library tour or a fun library tour. It's like, maybe take those qualifier descriptors out of there, because one person's idea of an excellent library tour might be very different from another person's idea. So you definitely want to try to keep it to the simplest language without a lot of, and nothing flowery. And then you always want to ask yourself this question about your research question. So what? Like, does your research question really address anything that anybody gives a darn about? Is it anything of value? Is it something is this research something that would be worth sharing with the rest of the library field. You should always ask yourself, because sometimes we have to do evaluation. A lot of you mentioned that. But when you're doing it because it's something you just want to know, you really need to ask yourself, so what? Why do I need to bother people with this questionnaire? What good is going to come of it? So keeping all that in mind. By the way, that link to that handout from Indiana University, my alma mater, is found in the materials section of your control panel. So if you expand the materials pane, you'll see a link in there to that document, and it's also in our Google folder for this class. Jamie, another Hoosier. Go IU. Yeah, kind of struggling in basketball this year. They could still pull it out though. We won't get into that. So here's some practice. Let's make these research questions better. So say your question is, are social networking sites harmful? Now, remember we wanted it to be specific? That's a pretty broad question. And the word harmful is a pretty murky word. So think about how we might rewrite that research question so that it's more specific. It addresses a specific audience, maybe a specific time frame or location, and does not include any murky language. Does anybody want to give that a try in the chat box? What are social networking sites harmful? Let me suggest maybe we could say something like, is our students at the library, our young people at the library, using social networking, or what specific purposes are our learners at the library using social networking for? Jeannie suggested, is extended time on social media sites during after school hours harmful? Still have that word harmful in there. So because what's harmful to one person, another person, that's a little bit of a murky word. But we could say, we could make it really specific. Are our after school students spending more than a half an hour on social networking when they're in the library? Now that would be very specific. If you're trying to get at this question, you want to know, first of all, how much time they're spending, because extended time, there might be a valid reason for them to spend extended time, but you could look at the literature and see what's recommended for people, young people of a certain age, and you could see whether they are going beyond that recommendation at your library and that's the kind of research question we want to get at. This is pretty hard stuff. So what about the next one? What is the effect on the environment from global warming? What do you see are the problems with that one? You don't have to rewrite it. Just tell me what you think are the problems. It's so broad. Thank you, Stacy. So right. It is so broad. Really, there's just, research, how would you research that? It's pretty much impossible to get your hands around it, your arms around it, or your entire body around it. It's just such a broad topic. And how about, how are libraries addressing the opioid crisis? What's the problem with that one? It's also overly broad. It's like, so it's on that question of, so what? Are we really all that interested in how they're addressing the opioid crisis? Or maybe our question would be more specific, like, is there a model for addressing the opioid crisis among libraries that we could use in our library? That would keep it much more. And Jody's saying that you are also assuming that your audience has specific knowledge, right? Right. that's where that so what comes in as well. It's like, are you making a big assumption with this research question? So it's always a good idea to run your research question by, and you can make this really informal. I know at the state library where I work, when we're thinking about doing a questionnaire on something, we'll stop and just say, so what is it we really want to know? What's the question we want answered by this? And if we can start to work in a group and just frame that question, even if we don't write it down, but we're all in agreement, what we really need, we need to know this because of we're going to do this with it. Then I think we can go forward and create a survey tool with more authority. So the research question, that's my first tip on creating good quality survey instruments. So there's some suggestions. So there are different types of surveys. Survey is a broad term, and we're just going to go into a couple of different types: questionnaires and interviews. Eventually we'll get into interviews in this class. This week we're going to focus more on questionnaires. So what can we learn from a survey? Thinking about what you noted when I asked you to think about something that you wanted to evaluate, would a survey help you in that evaluation? So like Diane was saying, she's interested in learning more, getting some information before she launches a library tour. Is a survey going to help her? A questionnaire could yield data on patron satisfaction, or it might tell you what other services are needed and help you to plan your next program. An interview might yield more substantive, qualitative data, like you might understand how, say, your presentation style is useful to some types of learners, but not so much for others. Maybe an interview would reveal that. So then you can adjust next time and accommodate more people in more of a positive way. So in a questionnaire, you can get quantitative data, I should say. You can also get qualitative data, but quantitative data is easier to report in charts and graphs. It's also easier to compare to other data that you might already have. So quantitative data, somebody mentioned trends, quantitative data over time. If you offer that same survey year after year, you might be able to see a trend. But it would be really hard in a questionnaire to get information about something that isn't fairly specific and defined, quite frankly, very specific and defined. Like it's hard to do, get people to imagine a new service in a questionnaire. You almost have to give them ideas and say, which of these ideas? And then you're already limiting your responses. So if you want to really like completely reimagine something at the library, a questionnaire might not be the right way to do it. Diane is adding, actually looking to see if the tour improves library anxiety. So if you're planning a library tour, you're trying to reduce library anxiety among your users, and you want to be able to evaluate whether that's effective or not. That sounds like a possible. You could actually approach that with a survey, or you might be able to questionnaire or an interview. So in a questionnaire, we talked about the quantitative data, which is easier to report in charts and graphs and to compare against previous year's data, especially if you ask exactly the same questions. But I also want to point out that you could use an interview with, say, some key persons. In the science, we call this key informants. In social science, so that makes it always sound like it's like undercover work, but it's not. Interviews take more time, but sometimes you only need a handful of interviews to get what you need. So like I said, we're gonna spend more time diving into questionnaires, but I want you to be thinking about, as we're doing this, when an interview might be a better choice. So, pros and cons of questionnaires. First of all, you look at your research question. Can you answer that research question with a questionnaire? Ask yourself that first, and then consider these. A questionnaire is inexpensive way. It's a very inexpensive way to collect data. It's a quick way to collect data. It's pretty appropriate for a variety of topics. And the quantitative data is easily compared to other data. So if those are things you really need and want, then maybe a questionnaire is right. But you also need to consider that questionnaire data can easily be biased, and it's hard to see the bias sometimes. There's a very limited ability to gain a holistic understanding of the topic in a questionnaire. And somebody mentioned, survey fatigue, or sometimes you feel like you're just not getting a very good response, and maybe people are just tired of taking your darn survey. And you have to figure out a different way to do it. So you want to use a questionnaire when you have data, when you already have data for comparative analysis, and you want to structure your new questionnaire similar to the data you have so that you can compare apples to apples. And you need information from a large population. That's a good time to use it. When you know that you can manage the inherent bias in a survey, and you have to go into a questionnaire always expecting that there's going to be some bias. We'll talk a little bit about what we know about how people answer questionnaires in a sec. And you need information quickly. So I'm going to give you an example from my experience. A few weeks ago, we have a problem at the state library. The problem is that when we do webinars like this, we record them and we post them to Vimeo. We have a Vimeo channel. We really like Vimeo at the state library. It allows us to organize our content. We like that there's not tons of advertising, but it's really quite difficult to get our videos closed captioned and posted to Vimeo. There's no automatic tool like there is in YouTube to closed caption our videos. And that's a problem for us because we're committed to providing closed captions to folks who are visually auditorially impaired, have difficulty listening to the audio on our webinars. So we also did have a very big assumption that we needed to check out. Our assumption was that schools and public agencies, people who work for government, couldn't access YouTube because it would be blocked by their network. And so we had to test that out because some people told us that wasn't true, and we assumed it was. So we asked. We did a one-question survey and got a really great response. We consider about, if we get 100 people in Montana, there's about 800 librarians in Montana. We have a listserv we send out to. If we can get 100 people to respond, that's a pretty good response. And we got well over 100 in the first week that we've had the survey out. And it told us exactly what we needed to know, that there isn't really a big difference between people who are blocked to Vimeo or people who are blocked to YouTube. It's pretty insignificant. So that's really been informative as we go forward to figure out how to make closed caption versions of our webinar recordings available. It was a real quick survey, and people are obviously interested in the question because we got a big response. So Diane was asking, are they more likely to ask a question after a tour? Is that one of the question? Is that the research question you're thinking about, or are you asking me if they're more likely to ask a question, or if that's something you're thinking about evaluating? Oh, she's looking for that. So that's an outcome you're looking for. You're looking for people to be more willing to engage with a librarian in your library after they've had a tour. Well, keep that in mind. Does anybody have any suggestions for Diane? So a survey may not be the way you want to collect that data. Maybe you just need to tabulate whether or not those people do ask questions. I mean, is there a way you can you can observe it, but is there, how do you tabulate and collect and capture that information? If they've taken the tour, I mean, you can't put a big like red star on them or something to indicate that this person has taken a tour, but that person has not. But you could train your frontline staff to, in fact, I would, no stars on anybody. That's a really bad idea. But you could train your frontline staff when they are asked a question to just inquire if that person's had a library tour, and you might be able to, and if they tabulated that on a little sheet somewhere, you could get that data that way. But you could also ask people after they completed the tour to just tell you whether they're more likely to ask if they feel more comfortable. You could ask them that. Do you feel more comfortable about asking a librarian a question now that you've taken the tour? And have them rate that on a scale. That would be perfectly acceptable. So in thinking about when you use a questionnaire, can you think of a time when a questionnaire, I told you my example of a questionnaire attained the data that I needed? Could you think of a time when the questionnaire really was useful and informative for you? So a couple of things came in for Diane's evaluation question about her tour. One was doing the post-tour survey, which I think is a good idea. And another is maybe just look for a rise in reference stats. So the number of, if you have the baseline data, normally on Wednesdays we have this many reference questions, but after we do these many tours, we saw an increase. So maybe you don't need to do a survey to be able to demonstrate that. It may not be causal, but it's a correlation. So one of the suggestions of if you can think of a time where a questionnaire attained the data you need, one of our librarians is saying when they were trying to decide on the new hours to be open. Yes, I'm actually going to use that question later on as an example. Yes, and that's another person pointing out, what hours should you be open? A survey or a questionnaire might be very useful for that. And it meets all these criteria too, right? Well, most of it, right? You need information from a large population. You can manage the inherent bias. The people who you're most interested in hearing from are probably going to be people that are already using your library. That's your population. If you need to reach out to a population that is underserved, and you know where they are, you can figure out a way to get that survey out to them as well. And you need the information quickly. So those are all good reasons to go ahead and use a questionnaire. But when should you not survey? Well, if there is sufficient data available elsewhere. So in the example of the library tour and whether or not it's successful, if you have good reference stats and you have a frontline staff that's really good at just keeping track of how many questions are asked in a day, and that's easy data to track, you're tracking it anyway, then maybe there's no need for a survey. If the answer to your research question is available in published research, we often think we have to come up with our own original research on everything. Like, one librarian was saying, well, how do we know, that playtime after story time is a good idea? It's like, well, lots of other people way smarter than us have already studied that. And there's examples of research in the published literature, scientific literature. So you do not need to research that again in your library if it's already been, if it's well-known, good quality research already available. Do not survey if there is an inherent bias and it will likely skew your data. So taking the example of what hours do you want open, if you are intending with increasing your hours to reach a brand new audience, don't survey the people that are already coming to the library. You have to reach out and figure out a way to get that information from the audience that is not coming into the library. If you have a poor sample, if you have a very small sample group, and you know you're not going to get a big response, then surveying is just going to waste their time and your time. And the last one we will dive into much more deeply in the third session, and that is if the survey or questionnaire itself may do harm. And there's a certain, we often don't think of answering questions as being harmful, but people can feel harmed, and or your data can harm a specific population. And I'm thinking of, if we say you wanted to know whether or not your book drop in your downtown location was worth keeping in place. Say it was vandalized, and so the board asked you to, think about just removing it. And it's not used a lot. You already know that. But you want to have some data in mind before you pull it up and yank it out of there. And you try to do a survey, but you have a clientele that use that book drop downtown that are not likely to respond to your survey. They're not inclined to respond to surveys, or you don't really know how to reach them. And so the data, whatever data you produce, is going to result in it looking like you should just take the book drop out. But you absolutely know that book drop is essential to a underserved population that is vulnerable, maybe transient people or whatever. And so doing that survey is going to take away library services to them altogether. If they can't drop their books off there, they probably won't get any books. So you have to look at what surveying might do to your population. So you never want to engage in surveying if it could do any harm. And like I said, we'll look at that much more specifically, the ethics of human subjects research in our last session. It's really quite a fascinating topic. So there are two types of questions on a questionnaire: closed questions and open-ended questions. So when we all went to school, we call these multiple choice and short answer. But actually there's more than just multiple choice. But you want to probably have both on your surveys and your questionnaires. When you create a questionnaire, you want to combine. Most of them do combine closed and open-ended questions. So with our research question, let's get back to Diane's suggestion of the book tour and whether or not that's going to reduce anxiety among library users. So they might, as an impact of that, might be that they would be more willing to ask reference questions to a librarian. So what kinds of closed and open-ended questions might we have for the folks who complete that tour? A closed question might be to rate their likelihood of asking a librarian a question. An open-ended question might be, well, why did you give the answer that you did? What concerns do you have about asking librarians questions? So you want to try to make sure that your question, most questionnaires you'll want to include both. There's times when you don't too. I mean, obviously we did actually, even, I should mention that when we did that short questionnaire about YouTube versus Vimeo, we did put in a comments box. It was optional. We got a lot of good information from that comments box that we obviously didn't ask. I mean, things like people who told us that the webinars they really relied on them. Other people who said they would really like the closed captions because they'd like the ability to be able to watch a webinar without having to put a headset on, so they could sit at the checkout counter in the library and do some professional development if they're not that busy, but they don't really want to put a headset on and look like they're totally tuned out to the public. So if there were closed captions, they would be able to watch and learn that way. And there are other people who told us that they just really, really prefer watching videos with the closed captions on all the time. So that was information that we got from the open-ended question that we hadn't anticipated a little little surprise, nice surprises. So here's back to our book drop downtown. Do you use the book drop downtown? Do you like the program? How well does this library service improve your life? Let's look at some questions. These might be better as open-ended questions. So why are these poor questions as closed questions? Do you use the book drop downtown? So let's say we put that on a little card that we hand to everyone who checks out books for the next 2 weeks at the library. Maybe that's a yes or no question. We won't have any answers to the why, and we won't be able to justify keeping that book drop there because we're probably going to get more no's than yeses. And because we already know it's not used a lot, but it might be very important to people, some people, maybe a vulnerable population. It might be better to ask how often, right, you use the book drop downtown, as opposed to a yes or no answer. That's better. How about the second one? Do you like the program? Another yes or no. Yes or no question answer. You could ask them to rate the program, right? And liking. Here's my question. So what? Do we care if somebody likes the program? What if they didn't like the program, but they learned everything they needed to learn about something, or they were challenged to try something new or to kind of get out of their comfort zone by the program? And here's the other thing about the do you like the program type questions. There is this issue of social desirability. And social desirability is it's very well documented. People on questionnaires aren't always truthful. They sometimes will answer the questionnaire as they think it should be answered, not as they really feel about something. So, and this is the kind of thing, it's one of the reasons, we don't ask at the state library, was your presenter well prepared? The truth is, as the coordinator for that program, the person who's overseeing that presenter, I better know whether they were well prepared or not long before I hire them. And certainly I shouldn't hire them again and I'll be able to tell. I probably don't need to put that in a survey, but most people will answer yes, they are well prepared, whether they were or not, because they don't want people to get into trouble. And so there's this phenomenon of people answering questions untruthfully when it involves something that they judge as an answer that that the answer should be this, so they'll just answer it that way. And then the last one, how well does your library service improve your life? And this is kind of a Likert scale. I often think that Likert scales are misapplied. That you're trying to really ask a qualitative question in a quantitative way, so you just slap it into a Likert scale. And I'm not sure that always works very well. So, in fact, it's kind of my pet peeve. So I would urge you to try to avoid Likert scales unless, there's you can really justify that it's a good application of one. So what about that one? How well does the library service improve your life? What do you see with the problems with that? Jody's saying the combination of questions can be important. I may not use that service myself, but I may highly value that service, that it's available to another populations. So she's saying studies in real life show that there are many who don't use the library but highly value their service in the community. Yes, exactly. That's a big shortcoming of when we use questionnaires and we're really only able to survey the people that are in the building, even though we know we have a whole bunch of supporters out there. We recently did a training with the Every Library folks who do advocacy training with library directors and trustees, and they have done a lot of research on, support for libraries. And one of the most curious bits of research that they shared in our last session that we did with them was that there isn't really a correlation between people who use the library and people who vote for the library. That the person who never uses the library is just as likely to vote for the library as the person who uses your library every single day. That you can't count on library patrons being a supporter of your library, which is really interesting to me. So back to this question, how well does the library service improve your life? Improving your life can be interpreted in many ways, says Dana. And she is so correct. That is really true. And Jeannie also said it's not specific enough. Right. We aren't asking them, did this, how, maybe as a qualitative question or an open-ended question, we could say, how will you apply this library service in your life? That might get us more information. But unfortunately, people are going to be really hard pressed to say, does this library service really improve my life? Well, they'll just go, well, I'll give it a 4 out of 5 because, or a 5 out of 5 because I'm nice and I thought it was fun. So yeah, you're not going to get a lot of really useful information on that one. How are we doing for time? Okay, we're getting close. I'm going to scooch through the last of this. So before you issue another questionnaire, here's some suggestions. Take a look at the literature. If there's any maybe existing data out there that already proves your point and you don't need to survey your clientele to prove your point. There's existing data that you already collect, like Stefan was pointing out, maybe your reference statistics, you're already collecting that. Maybe that's the way that you want to prove your point. Make sure you get the right sample. Number of people, the sample refers to the people who are responding to your group. Maybe instead of doing a survey, consider interviewing some key informants. This sounds like it's hard and will take a lot of time, but actually you only need to interview people until you start getting the same answers over and over again. So if you're in the case of the library tour, maybe you just interview a few people. And when you start getting the same answers over and over again, then you know you've got an adequate response. Or consider just a simple poll as opposed to a long format questionnaire. And on the screen is coffee beans. You might be wondering, why does she have a bunch of coffee beans? One of the ways I like to do polls if I'm doing a face-to-face training is, and I've seen libraries do this as well, you just set up a couple of mason jars and some beans, and you put like maybe 10 beans in a little Ziploc, and you hand it to patrons. And on one, this is a great one for if you are trying to expand your office hours, right? On one, you put, we'll be open Wednesday nights, Thursday nights, or Friday nights. And people get 10 beans and they can distribute them among those 3 jars in the way that they say, well, I really want Thursday night, but I could handle Friday night. I just don't want Wednesday night. They can put their beans in Thursday and Friday night. And that way it's very visible. People can actually see as the beans are mounting in the jars. And then all you gotta do is take a photo of the results. You don't have to get in there and actually count them. If you have a big enough sample, you'll be able to see it. And if you don't have a really big sample, use a narrow graduated cylinder, like you have in science class for measuring liquid volume. Just use those instead, because that will show up really quickly. You won't have to have more than 10 or 15 participants before it'll become pretty clear. So polls are fun. And I was going to tell you about this guy, Kahoots, and we're not going to have time to do one today. Well, maybe we will. We'll see. I actually set up a little Kahoot for you. Kahoot is an online polling game, basically. It was really designed for K-12 teachers to use, and like doing little drills with their classroom. And you use your smartphone to do your Kahoot. So I will stay today and do a Kahoot with anyone who wants to stay. Because they're really, really fun. And this is your homework for next 2 weeks. You got 2 weeks to do this. Write a research question. And the tips that I had for research questions are posted in our Google folder. And I will make sure that you all get a copy of that get a link to that Google folder, you'll find it in the materials section of our control panel today, and I'm going to put that into, so let me just open it right now. There's our Google folder. I'm going to take this link and throw it in the chat box so that you can click on it and open it up yourself. And you'll see there's one document in there that lists what our homework is for today. And I'd like you to write your research question. And then one or two, at least two questions for a questionnaire. One open-ended, one closed, related to your research question. And then post your work in the Google folder so we all can see what everybody's work is and learn from each other. And then these are the tips, right? Keep to one important issue. Make sure it's not a yes or no question. Keep it focused, be clear, and then ask yourself, so what? Does your research question cover something important? And then give it a try with one of the open-ended and one of the closed questions. And then this document is the handout that I also have posted in the materials section for how to develop a research question. And with that, I'll be happy to take questions. And I'll show you how a Kahoot works. You ready to go to the Kahoot? That's my home. So the way this works, you get your smartphone out. I've got mine out. And if you need to leave, feel free. I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording, but if you need to, because it is the top of the hour, getting very close. If you are watching the recording, I check the description for the recording, and it'll have all the links to all this information.